So the information sessions that will be taking place will be the first, I think tonight's a Tuesday night, so the first Tuesday night of every month from now through June. And they'll follow this basic format of about 3 or 4 people who have some level of expertise related to the Bosque. And there'll be an opportunity for questions from the audience. And then there's also some opportunities for some, not with this session, but the April through June sessions of going out into the field and actually seeing the Bosque up close and personal. So for those of you who are kind of waiting for somebody else to ask a question, so if you would turn to the person who you are sitting near that you don't know, introduce yourself to them and tell them what the Bosque means to you. Take that 15 seconds to ready, go.
She volunteers it. That's why it means so much to me.
So how many met somebody new? Well, there are thousands of people out there. There's 4,000 people on a Facebook page about the Bosque, and there's hundreds of people who have been coming and attending meetings. It's good. It's good. I'm meeting everybody. It's a meet and greet session. And there was a question, was this meeting about the mayor's plan with the Rio Grande vision? And the answer is no. This meeting is an opportunity for people to learn about the Bosque, and the whole series of meetings that are taking place are to increase opportunities for education in and around and about the Bosque. So there will be, you can go to ABQ, the plan, and the website, and Barbara Baca can correct me if I'm wrong here. You can go and see where that process is. The process right now is gathering information through the biological assessment and ecological assessment work that's taking place. And there are no shovels on the ground, and there's nobody doing anything right now until there's more information, and then a plan comes out that'll be revised later. But even that, there's not a hard and fast date on when that will be. Is that correct?
So the fall, this coming fall is when we'll come back out.
So the fall, but it's not like by September 15th, which is not even the fall yet. That's still summer, I'm told, September 15th. Yeah. So that plan will be coming forward. I think one of the opportunities is that there have been so many meetings and discussions and neighborhood association conversations and resolutions about the mayor's plan. That's clear that there are lots of different viewpoints on the issue, and there hasn't been as much opportunity to have just, what do we know about the Bosque, and allow the public to have access to information that a lot of the experts in the community have. And so who are these people? And if I want to find out more information about flood history, I could ask, ready? Go. I think you have a question.
Oh, yeah. Couple of flood questions. There's a great dicho in Spanish, más se perdió en el diluvio. A whole lot was lost in the great flood, in Noah's flood, right? So don't worry too much, but if you lived in San Marcial in 1920s, it was a good time to be worried. My colleagues can tell you more about the reasons for that flood, the sediment that started building up back behind Elephant View Dam. In a longer presentation, I could play the Corrido de San Marcial for you, where it's just so miraculous that no one died in that flood. Everything filled with sand. They had a beautiful stone roundhouse there, the Casa Redonda, filled with sand, the church filled with sand. Anyway, 3 years ago, I went to a reunion of people with connections to San Marcial. It was in a park in Socorro, and the park was full of people, and only 3 of them were old enough to have remembered San Marcial as a town, and that sentiment of belonging to a village was just so amazing to see everyone else there. Anyway, so I'll pass the mic on that question. The other one's a one-liner. What washed out bridge was that? It was the Barelas Bridge. I'm not sure what bridges were going on up in the Alameda area, just that the river moved all the way from Edith to its present location. That's about 3 miles. It took out the church, it took out every orchard, every house. I don't think anybody there died either. Que milagro.
Okay. I think Enrique wanted me to touch a little bit on the physical processes that caused the big flood in San Marcial. You keep in mind that back then we didn't have a dam on the Galisteo, we didn't have a dam on the Jemez, and we didn't have coaches. A good snow melt and a couple of good rainfalls could create huge flows down the river. As Paul's hydrograph chart showed earlier, the Middle Rio Grande could see flows of almost 20,000 cubic feet per second. During the summer right now, just to give you a comparison, we're required to keep the river flowing to the central bridge at 100 cubic feet per second. So that's what you've been seeing. And actually this last summer, it was down to 75 cubic feet per second. So imagine 20,000 rolling by and carrying all that sand that was due for San Marcial. San Marcial was actually the bottom end of the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District in the original plans. So we had to adjust a little bit then in 29.
I'll just add real quickly that it was sort of the early part of the 20th century, there were a lot of big floods. So climatically, it was a very wet time. There was also this land use stuff that Adrian was referring to, a lot of intensive grazing, and coupled with elephant butte that was put in 1907, 1908. And so what that did, and we saw these issues today down there, is it caused the slope to drop off as it was approaching elephant butte. So it's a combination of those 3 things, I think, that left San Marcial short for this world.
Okay, and so the next question is about salinity. So salinity, what is it and where are we with it now? Since you have the microphone.
Yeah, I better, yeah. It's my hydrologist, I better answer that one. So yeah, salinity, it's a measure of salt. You often, parts per thousand, 35 parts per thousand of salt water. It's really important to understand salinity in the ecosystem as it is today. It's a pretty fresh system compared to other systems in the Southwest, the Middle Rio Grande is. But it's really important for understanding when you're doing restoration what the potential is by the salinity of it. Different species have different tolerances. One thing that I did mention, and I will say again because it's something we're looking at doing at Valle de Oro, a refuge, is trying to restore saltgrass meadow. And that was, maybe artificially a high percentage of the composition, but it's still a big part of this ecosystem in its native state. And that actually requires salt. So it looks for places with salt. So I guess salt is not always your enemy, but it's something really important to understand.
But in terms of cottonwoods, salt
Tolerance? What is it in around 2 or 3 parts per thousand, sort of the limit, I think is usually considered. But it also depends on the texture of the soil. And the tighter the texture, the saltier it tends to be. There's more clay in the soil. So that's another way to get a sense that there's a lot of salinity in the area that you're in.
And just for a quick statement for anyone who doesn't know what Valle de Oro is, if you could just say where that is and what's taking place.
So yeah, I'm just promoting in a glib fashion a new wildlife refuge that's going on in South Albuquerque. Valle de Oro is a former Price dairy, and we are working on purchasing still, but hope to have the property and be able to do what we've done similarly at places like Bosque del Apache, where in farm field settings, we're emulating historic processes, or what I talked about in my talk, and when we do that, we often see very cool results in terms of the responses of the native plants.
Okay. And I think, so let's hop into this one, which is, Is it true that there are 2 houses near Socorro in the floodplain that keep us from flooding the Bosque? And that assumes that there's actually water to be able to flood with.
Yeah, I'm not sure about 2 particular houses in the Bosque down in Socorro. There is some development definitely in the Socorro area in the floodplain. I know of a friend who has a shed down on the floodplain portion of her property. We have a little bit of development here in Albuquerque that is encroached into the Bosque. The prime difficulty with flooding the Bosque now is the reverse of what I described earlier. Rather than a grading, now our river is starved for sediment because of Cochiti. So our river is now becoming incised, it's degrading, so it's cutting deeper and deeper. So it takes much more water to get up and over the banks into the floodplain than it used to. And we just don't have that water. So a lot of the restoration efforts that are going on out there, and Paul can speak to these much more eloquently than I can, are what we call flood bank lowering projects, where we are now lowering the floodplain to meet the level of the river. It's very what we call active restoration, big yellow machines out there, as opposed to passive restoration, which is possible on river systems that are still connected to their floodplain and still have natural hydrographs, like the Gila River down in southwestern New Mexico.
As long as you have the microphone. So who owned the river before the MRGCD owned it?
Well, you know, it's a loaded question.
Well, sure. I've got 3 more in here.
Where is Yasmin? You do hear folks say, that is the MRGCD's river, or that's our water. We are in an unadjudicated area. So I cannot tell you if the MRGCD owns that water or if the farmers own that water. We're going to have to either settle that issue or litigate that issue. And the law is very murky. The Conservancy Act is a remarkable read and a very difficult to understand piece of law. To get to sort of the more general answer, the river was being utilized, primarily by farmers up and down this valley. Again, in my neighborhood, Los Terranes, our ditch, as best we know from records, went in 1709. The folks down in Etrisco were there possibly 5 or 10 years earlier. It's mostly been farming and diverted straight out of the river.
Well, you handled that well.
That was a one-liner. Dios. You own the river? Dios. How about that?
Do you want to keep going? Because there are some cultural issues about that aren't really legal issues with this river, and I'm not sure if we had the opportunity to kind of run with that.
Yeah, I think from the point of view of traditional acequia governance, that it was, what was that number? 62 to 78 tomas were in the same stretch as the conservancy that the conservancy occupies today. A toma is where the water is taken, literally drunk, taken out to serve one acequia or another. And of course, in this part of New Mexico, they were washed away all the time. So you'd see people building brush dams, much like the one that you still see up in Velarde, La Joya, up at the exit of Taos Canyon. These units, these governmental units, as much as Hispanic culture, as much of a hit as we take for being members of very patriarchal and authoritarian culture that began with the Roman emperors and went through all these series of generalissimos and that we're conniving and that we're always trying to figure out how to deal with this authority in our lives and stuff like this. That's the stereotype. The reality is much different. There are democratic institutions in New Mexico in the 16th and 17th century. One is the Acequia Association, the basic governance there. The other is the Cabildo. We had town councils, wall to wall. And So these little governments, each one of those 70-some acequia systems had a little government going. And so what you're seeing today is some of these, under the new legislation governing acequias as subdivisions of the state, even within the Conservancy, neighbors are getting together and forming associations, and in my case, working very closely with the MRGCD. The ditch rider just called me up before the session saying, he's going to flush the Gallegos lateral, and don't let anybody take any of that water. It's just the flushing that's happening because there's some other projects going on. So we help him out. There's some adversarial relationships with other acequia associations, but in our case, all of our sublaterals are on private land. So we take care of that, and we tell the neighbors not to bother the Conservancy with our arguments. We solve them ourselves, and it really is. If people don't like what you're doing, they vote you out. It is democracy, water democracy. A bit of culture and history.
And just to clarify, so earlier tonight I said we'd be out by 8. We still will be out by 8, but we're going to spend a little bit more time here because there's still a good pile of questions to go through, and even in a meet and greet, and if you were 2 or 3 people back, you probably couldn't hear what was being asked of the people. So we're going to continue to have access to the expertise as a collective, because we love collectives. Yes. Okay. So let's see what we have. Okay, Paul expresses interest in managing as an ecosystem, including flooding. What is the probability of that really happening between Alameda and Rio Bravo? How is the goal affected by the mayor's plan?
I guess that's me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You're Paul.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess a couple thoughts on that. I could definitely give that a lot. It's a good question. The first thought is that there is, to understand where flooding is occurring, and we've done a lot of modeling of this in the middle of Rio Grande, to understand where it is occurring and what places. So there actually is flooding occurring. A lot of the bars and islands are basically effectively a floodplain anymore. So it becomes like this inset active floodplain. What we call a floodplain is really a terrace, a drier surface. And I think it's important to keep in mind when you talk about this restoration. We're really trying to restore something onto this terrace surface that doesn't really have the process associated with it. So there is flooding going on. There are active places throughout the Rio Grande, every part. Go down to the bar, go down to the river, and you will see fresh veg. But my other thought, though, with that one, to kind of anticipate this one, is I do think under climate change, we're sort of in the midst of this brutal drought. And this brutal drought arguably should be here. I'm sure it is amplified by warming. There's no doubt in my mind that it is. And just for the fun of it, I'd say that maybe about 25 or 30% of it is amplification. There's been some recent work on this. But we're still in a natural drought. When we flip back to a wetter cycle, there is the potential. Now, there's a lot of argument and discourse in the literature these days on this topic about potential for big El Nino years, something that we haven't seen before, something really stupendous. And like this last fall, the flooding this last fall, I think there is a potential for some really high flood events and stuff that may not be controllable. They may be coming in below coaching. So I think we arguably should anticipate that as well and take advantage of that, and have it so that we don't put something out there that is going to get in the way of a potential flood of, say, 10,000 CFS, or some level that we say, okay, we could live with that flooding. I think it would very much benefit the ecosystem, and I think we're potentially not far from it, arguably.
Does anybody else want to add on to that? Speak for Paul, because it was. And along those lines, too, some of those predictions are looking at those pulse events being much later in the year, not during the growing season of what we're used to. So, are you aware of all that?
Actually, earlier, right?
Later, we'll be looking at more September, October events with
Right.
large river flows. And that's consistent with like what the Gila has experienced across time. not necessarily what the Rio Grande has experienced.
Yeah, and then also the spring pulse is going to be a lot sooner. You know, there's lots of issues with that. I mean, I just think that water on the surface is a really good thing. There's a lot of mess out there. There's a lot of scrap, but I think that we should manage to have as much wildness in the river as possible and take advantage of it when it comes. That's all.
So I always like to point out to people that what we're seeing in terms of what people are calling a drought is still above the mean of water in the last 10,000 years across this landscape. So it's not really a drought if you're still above the mean. So we're not even used to as a community what real dry periods look like on this landscape. Just to keep you happy. Okay, here's one. We can sing a birthday song. How old is the average cottonwood in the Bosque?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can't really treat core bosque cottonwoods because they're pretty funky. We associate a lot of the trees out there the same age class again, that 1942 flood. So a lot of the same tree size associated with that. But I love the big old cottonwoods that are in our valley outside the active floodplain. And I photograph a lot of those and just enamored by them. And I don't know, it'd be really cool to know how old a cottonwood tree can last. And I don't know I don't have an answer to that.
Somebody from Grinnell College was that Iowa was doing tree core work. Do you remember that? Him or Esty?
Do you have SDPO?
Well, I think those big guys get up around 120 to 150 years old.
Okay.
120 to 150 years old.
SDPO about 5 years.
Yeah.
They're not that old.
Okay. And then the other thing was, the oldest tree, and then the youngest tree. And the youngest tree is from this past spring. So we actually do have, as Paul said, vegetation that's emerging on the riverbanks, on the islands, but it's not as widespread. You don't have the kind of cataclysmic events to be a driver as we would have had in the past. Okay. Well, there's one here that it's always fun to talk about Texas. So, and I'll show you this, because I like to show that the Rio Grande starts up here in the headwaters of Colorado, comes across that Alamosa Basin, so that by the time we're at my wrist, we're now in New Mexico. And if we're traveling all the way down the Rio Grande, we come through the middle Rio Grande, which is sort of through here. And then my armpit is El Paso. And then this takes us across to Texas. So it's my favorite joke of the month. So I use it every time I can. My wife's from El Paso, but
We always leave out the other, our river is a double header. It's got another headwaters that's very productive in the headwaters of the Conchos River in Chihuahua, the Sierra Tarahumara, all of that, and hardly anybody ever remembers that.
And if you go down to Big Bend or any of those sections of that, the most stretch of the river, right? We're thinking of the Rio Grande is here, but this only drops us into, 600 miles, and we still have another 1,200 miles to go by the time we're at El Paso. And we've got that influx coming in from northern Mexico that actually is giving the water that people are using as we go canoeing down the Rio Grande through Big Bend. Yasmin, we're so glad you're here. Yasmin is a poet, a planner, and she is responsible for all those 11,000 irrigators.
No, that's not true.
Living in a green oasis. And one of the things and it's true that Yasmin is a poet, and one of her charges is that ecological response that kind of comes along with the irrigated lands. And so all of the 400 and some vertebrate species that are in the middle Rio Grande, she's thinking about ways to protect those and to have a mosaic across the MRGCD lands while still providing the flood issue protection and the irrigation. Do you want to, they already gave your talk, but do you want to give like a
Yeah,
little?
thank you, Dana. Sorry that I wasn't able to be here. I got caught in one of Albuquerque's versions of Cops in my own neighborhood, unfortunately. So I was able to get out, but I hope you've been having a productive discussion. And I apologize.
Tell them your favorite thing about the Bosque.
My favorite thing about the Bosque, oh boy. I think really to be able to step outside the city into a place where you can really feel like that you're in nature. I think that's a very unique experience that we have here. I think it's very exceptional. And people in most cities in this country and around the states don't know that experience and probably won't have it. So I like to go barefoot walking on the sandbars. Valencia County is probably, sorry Albuquerque, probably my favorite Bosque because we still have a lot of connection between the Bosque and the river there and a lot of native species. But I've been proud of a lot of the work that we've done to try to revive and restore the Bosque. We still got a lot of work to do, but I think we've made some really good headway, especially here in Albuquerque.
I think when you hear that somebody's a planner with the MRGCD, you don't necessarily think of somebody who has their radar up on 400 vertebrate species, who walks barefoot along the river and writes poetry. But that's Yasmin's story. And there's so many people who spend their professional lives in and around the Bosque and in the river and have that same love for it. And it's not restricted to one agency. The city has people like that, the federal agencies. And if you look at the number of agencies with jurisdiction in the Middle Rio Grande, it's more than 24 who claim the water or who are in court with each other over whether or not it's their land or somebody else's land and who has jurisdiction. But I think you'll find the people that are on the ground doing the actual research and the planning, by and large, have a lot of knowledge and a lot of love for the resource that they work with. And we see that with the people in this panel and certainly with the other panels that will be gathered later on. So, all right, that was just editorial comment. Okay, the Texas Water Compact. How much does New Mexico owe Texas, and how does this affect the river and the Bosque restoration plan?
Okay. It changes every year. So the Rio Grande Compact is what we refer to as a gauging compact. And so depending on how much water flows past a certain gauge on the Rio Grande, and this is the Ottawa gauge of North Hispaniola, and then that determines how much water we can use here in New Mexico. The amount of water that flows past the gauge down in San Marcial determines how much water we have to deliver to Texas. We do have a bulk obligation delivery to Mexico, where we have to deliver 60,000 acre-feet of water every year to Mexico. Texas currently has got us in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has decided to accept the case, although the first thing they're going to hear is New Mexico's argument that the case should be dismissed. You may have seen in the news recently that the United States has also asked to join the case, and they share the viewpoint of Texas that New Mexico has been taking too much water. And just to be clear, because a lot of folks...
He's taking it right now.
I'm not really sure where this is from, but it may well be. The complaint is not that we're using too much water up here in the Middle Rio Grande. The complaint is specific to excessive use of groundwater below Elephant Butte Dam. And the Middle Rio Grande has not yet been mentioned in this court case or in any of the pleadings, but we're keeping a very close eye on it because Texas is being very aggressive right now, going after water from Louisiana, from Oklahoma, and eventually they're going to be eyeing the Middle Rio Grande.
This comes from Walmart, so it was not bottled at Coors and Montano. Okay. If water got as high as it did in San Marcial, what would happen to Bosque, I guess it is. If the water got as,
So if there was a similar flood as there was at San Martial in 1929, what would it do to the Bosque?
I think that's right.
Okay.
Is that?
So 20, what was that? How many CFS was that 29 flood? Was it 30? We're not 30,000, obviously. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so a lot of the levees in the Middle Rio Grande are sand spoil levees, and certainly they would saturate and fail, and it would be a big mess.
Does anybody need to?
Well, there'd probably be a new, yeah, it would be, if it was done at the proper timing, if it was a spring flood that did this deed, then it certainly would recruit cottonwoods if it was at the right time. And, you know, Cochise has pretty big flood retention space in it. It would have to take a lot for a spring pulse to move through there like that. So.
And actually, I'm going to grab it for a moment. Just to put it in perspective, Cochise, we regularly hold 50,000 acre feet there for recreation. Cochise has a flood capacity of 500,000, where it would back all the way up to the end of the earth.
So in the early 1900s, and I'm not sure if anybody talked about this in the presentations, and maybe Enrique did, so in about 10 out of 20 years, we had floods in the Rio Grande of more than 15,000 cubic feet per second. And at that time, in the 1920s, the river had aggraded to the point where the capacity for it to carry flows without flooding was only about 12,000 cubic feet per second, which sounds pretty good right now compared to what it is now, but back then it wasn't very much. So there were a number of floods that were 20, 25,000, 30,000 cubic feet per second, but they caused very widespread flooding, particularly on the east side of Albuquerque. The river bank was frequently breached around Alameda, and so the flood flows would flow down the east side and pond all through the North Valley and up to the railroad tracks. People basically kind of got out with their lives if they heard the water coming and tried to get east of Edith. So, if that happened now where Enrique and I live, for example, and of course probably Adrian too, but since I live on 8th Street, basically I would have to try to make my way towards Enrique's house east of 4th, and hopefully he would throw a rope around me and try to drag me through. Back then the whole area around Edith was vegas or swamps. In fact, the whole area west of Rio Grande was all swamps at that time. Nobody really lived there, so until Dietz came. So he would have to kind of pull me up to high ground east of Edith and hope that we made it.
Sounds like a Hemingway novel.
Yeah, exactly. We actually had a poetry venue over there.
All those dead right
It was
now.
called
It's
East
the
of
same
Edith.
name. Okay. So this has been a wonderful information presentation. That's like a shout out to you guys there. Are you preaching to the choir, or are there representatives from the mayor's office here? And so the city staff, so if you just kind of raise your hand so people can track you down later. Happily. But we do have, and so really these are educational opportunities for everybody involved in the river and the community. And I've spent 30 years in the Bosque firefighting and researching and teaching, and I know that I'm walking out of here with lots of information that I've never had before. And so it's this learning process for us all. So I know that the mayor's staff is committed to learning and be a part of this educational process. That's why they're here tonight, and that's why they're at help to organize this. Okay. What new project is the MRGCD planning in Old Town, and will there be water in Old Town?
I don't know if that's a new project. It was something that was talked about some time ago. And actually, I asked Mr. Shaw about it, and he said, well,
Different Mr. Shaw.
Sorry, Subha Shah, who's the chief engineer of the Conservancy, right? The River Rock project was originally a Conservancy District project, the River Walk plan that was done many years ago. And, but that was for a river walk that was going to be outside the Bosque and outside the levees. And it never really came to fruition. So I did happen to read about this Old Town plan with, you know, canals and gondolas and maybe, I'm exaggerating, but to develop some canals and trails between Old Town and the biopark. But I don't know the status of that. It doesn't seem to have gone anywhere.
And there's a question here about proposals for the Bosque having structures and other improvements at or near a river's edge. How will these structures be impacted by severe storms such as the storm last September? And reestablish high spring runoff flows?
Okay. That's a very good question. And probably some of you have noticed that there have been some boardwalks put into the Bosque now, and that's part of the Bosque ecosystem restoration. There was a small amount of money that was available for some recreation improvements, and that's a Army Corps of Engineers project, and the Conservancy is the local sponsor of that project. So, you know, when those kinds of structures are put in, and we do try to minimize them, but we do want to provide some opportunities for, particularly for people who have mobility issues, to be able to also enjoy the river at the bank. So, you know, those are obviously kind of armored, and then we plant around them so that they can withstand some flooding. And if the Army Corps can't build something that can withstand flooding, I think we're all in trouble, right? So, oh wait, sorry, yeah. All right, never mind. Anyway. I just stepped in that one, didn't I? You know, I think it's a good question. You know, it's, you know, certainly we can build things that can withstand flooding in the floodplain if that's what we want to do. But, you know, the concern about building on the banks of the river too much is that, you know, especially in these drought years as the water tables have dropped, you know, it's the banks of the river that really have the water, you know, the water connection that's maybe high enough to support our native plants like willows in particular. And so that's where a lot of our good native habitat is. And of course, that's where a lot of restoration projects have been constructed, particularly for endangered species, where we can have some seasonal flooding that would, you know, that would help to benefit the silvery minnow. So, you know, I think we have to be mindful about doing too much construction on the banks of the river. That's my opinion. Also, we have millions of dollars invested in those projects. And, you know, of course, we have a lot of issues with endangered species themselves. So, you know, we're responsible for their recovery. So we definitely have to be mindful of that.
So there's two endangered species that we're talking about, so you want to mention those? And then the candidate species.
Right. You know, the Rio Grande silvery minnow, which I'm sure most people know, and the southwestern willow flycatcher, which is a small migratory bird that breeds here in the summertime. And then we have the candidate species of the yellow-billed cuckoo, I think was just listed. Mm-hmm. And what else? The jumping mouse?
The New Mexico meadow jumping mouse.
Right, meadow jumping mouse.
Mm-hmm. And so, oh, I just had this one, the dams. So Paul.
Okay. Does
anybody have any more cards for any follow-up things that come to mind?
Okay, the question is any of the sedimentation lost from the dams replaced by construction sediment on the west side? Probably some, but the scale of which it is not comparable, but it is a good question. I mean, a good question about, so a lot of this stuff, like I said, that I'd like to promote in this whole discussion is that we can return some of the stuff like sediment and flooding, but still do it safely in a way that can be managed for the concerns, the reason why we put the things in like the riverside drains and the jetty jacks. I really think we can manage the system and return some wildness to it. So with that, there were some historic work done about the source of sediment in the Rio Grande, and I believe that about a third of it came from below Cochiti. So if there's any, and there's things like the Galisteo River that is now, has been cleared of salt cedar and now is getting sediment to the river. The Jemez Dam, passing sediment through that, largely fine grain goes through now, but we need to get some of that coarser grain stuff. These are sort of the projects I think that are important overall to get sediment in the system and strike some sort of balance. So I guess, I think this question is sort of a pivot to that answer. that sediment is important, and we should be looking for opportunities to return sediment to the system and manage sediment in the system, and use all the fine engineers out there to do that in a safe way.
Yasmin has a follow-up.
Just a quick follow-up, and I hope this hasn't already been said, but I agree with Paul, but we have a situation of the riverbed degrading in the northern reach of the Middle Rio Grande and grading in the southern reach down in Socorro County and Bosque del Apache, where the riverbed is higher than the adjacent land in a lot of places, but particularly down south. And so it's much more prone to flooding down there. You get a lot of sediment input from the Rio Puerco in particular and the Rio Salado into the Rio Grande. So one of the considerations in terms of having this kind of controlled flooding that might benefit the Bosque is the higher we try to pump up the flooding so that we could get overbanking in Albuquerque, which would take a lot of water anyway, which we probably don't have. The more likely we are to be flooding out areas of Belen and Socorro down south. So it's kind of a tricky situation. I think, because of the low water supply that we're dealing with and other types of legal constraints, that's why we really try to create habitat that just seasonally floods when the water's high enough, so it's not really having an impact on water supply and not also on the safety with the levees and the safety of people down south.
So there's a card here that just has a statement about the mayor's development plan versus people's plan to conserve the Bosque, but not really a question. So if somebody wants to give me a question, whatever, we can put that aside, or we've already kind of addressed some of those ideas. And then, I'm not sure if this was a question or not, for forums, PowerPoint needed. We need a description of the biological diversity of the Rio Grande Valley State Park. And so do you want to talk to some resources that people can access to get some of that information about a biological diversity? Where do you find these?
Great question, and I happen to bring the tome. This is available as a PDF now. It's the Middle Rio Grande Bosque Biological Plan, done in 1992, was it? Yeah, a bunch of notes here. And there's an updated version too that was more of a historical since the plan. And this is, by a lot of the real, 1993, by Cliff Crawford, Ann Culley, Rob Whitehouser, Mark Siflitz, Larry White, and James Wilbers. And Cliff Crawford's #1 on that, and he certainly is, in many ways, the godfather and soul of a lot of this work that's been done in the Rio Grande. Really brought ecosystem management focus to the Rio Grande before there was a silver minnow, before there was southwestern flycatcher on the scene. We really look at this thing as an ecosystem. So I really encourage that. And the other book that I think
Before there was a willow flycatcher, there was Cliff Crawford.
Right, exactly.
I think for me, I feel that really good.
What I'm saying is that before those things, before the single species came into the picture, which are really critical, don't get me wrong, really need to deal with these endangered species, but there was the culture of an ecosystem management through this project and lots of meetings, and his agency, Cliff was amazing at outreaching to agency folks, and so there was this whole culture that was there before that, and I think it's really benefited all the stuff that's happened since then, because all the money's associated with endangered species stuff. And then while I'm at it, I will promote another book that I think is really cool, that is this one by Dan Skurlock, called From the Rio to the Sierra, an environmental history of the Middle Rio Grande. Just awesome document about historical, I think a lot of quotes from here, and I'll push that as well, but this is more the synthesis on the ecology, but this has a lot of the historical stuff put together, and this is available as a PDF as well.
And let's remember all of the great curriculum work that was done by Albuquerque Public School teachers and in connection with the private schools as well. The Bosque Education Guide, just full of incredible activities and whatnot. That's been a moving target for all these years, but I'm not sure what the latest iteration of it is. But the
work of Tish Morris and Mary Stuver and their colleagues with that is still being used. There's a Bosque education workshop that's, I don't know, is anyone here from the Nature Center? Yeah, and so they're regularly held, and there are trainings going on constantly to engage kids with that. And going back, the Albuquerque environmental story with the Rosner's work, so the 70s. So people have been, like the Bosque is not new. And the Bosque is not new as an educational resource, as an environmental learning center, and that there have been people doing this work for decades. And those are just the ones I happen to know, but I bet you there's somebody here in the 40s and 50s who is doing something with their kids with 4-H out along the river. So we're not discovering something, we're discovering the modern iteration of that. Yeah. So.
And there's bilingual glossaries in there too for all of them.
And Jean-Luc's book too.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention it because it's probably on sale here in the gift shop. A couple years ago, a great collection of scientists came out with a field guide for the Middle Rio Grande Bosque. So if you actually want to see which spiders are in our bosque, you can take a look at it. And it's a lot of fun to see, them list things like bears and mountain lions and other critters you don't see so often. Another effort, I'm just going to make a shameless plug here. Another effort that's underway right now, the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District has sponsored the formulation of what's referred to as a conservation action plan. And through this process, we are identifying ecological targets that we want to protect. We're identifying threats to those targets and then strategies that we can implement and measure. To try to protect those targets. We're looking at it from a very ecosystem-oriented approach. And I say we, and I shouldn't because I'm trying to stay out of the process as much as possible. But Esty Moldavan, who's back there in the back row with the New Mexico Natural Heritage Program, is leading the effort for us in partnership with the Natural Heritage Program at Colorado State University. And I'm really grateful to him for the work he's doing. And hopefully we're going to get that out before the end of the year, and it should really illuminate a lot about how the Bosque functions and how we can protect it.
Great. And a tie-in question to that is, what portions of the Rio Grande is in good shape and why? And what portions of the Rio Grande and Bosque is in bad shape and why? So when you're actually identifying where to put resources for restoration efforts, where are you going and why?
Yes.
And what are you leaving alone?
Yes is the answer. I mean, there really is no simple question to that. There's water up at the north end, but the river, when you get down to Socorro and south of Socorro, it's where the river regularly overbanks and is connected, and the qualities, for instance, at Bosque del Apache, I think are very, emulate the historic conditions. They're very reminiscent of this mosaic, but it goes dry down there, and it's really hard to keep water down there. It's below, when you get, it's really this jetty jack channel that I showed, that 600-foot wide channel that is really prominent from Bernardo down to South Belen. I mean, from Bernalillo down to Bernardo. Bernalillo is the worst one. Bernalillo to Bernardo is that 600-foot wide channel. It's very, when you get below there, the Rio Puerco and the Salado come in and sort of rewild it just by the sediment and the high flows. But it's also harder to keep water down there. So,
I hope all of you have been to the Bosque del Apache Refuge. They were really, and some of the biologists that work there were really the pioneers of a lot of the restoration techniques that we use in the Bosque today. And they're fortunate that although they don't have much water in the river a lot of times, they do have a lot of the district's canals and drains and the low flow conveyance channel for which they're able to get the tail end of water. And they do have the ability, because they have canals and turnouts on the refuge, to manage the water to really have a very beautiful mosaic of native plant communities and do a lot of restoration work. So as I mentioned before, I think where we have much better groundwater and river connection, such as in Valencia County, when we do restoration, it can be more successful. And in some cases, we don't have to do much. We can just remove some of the non-natives, and the natives are already there, particularly after fires. So it's a little more challenging in areas where we have the lower water tables, such as in Albuquerque. I think we've made a lot of strides in a lot of parts of the district in terms of abating the catastrophic fire risk. We've done work in Bernalillo and Peña Blanca, a little bit of property there, probably at least 25% of Corrales, and almost all of the Rio Grande Valley State Park has had those treatments. Quite a bit in Valencia County, although we still, I think, have a lot more that needs to be done there, especially to rehabilitate the very large and devastating fires that we've had in the southern part of the county, or northern Socorro County. And we've done quite a bit of work in Socorro County. We have about, I think, 15 to 20 riverine parks in Socorro. They're on Conservancy District land, little pocket parks. So a lot of work has been done around those areas as well. So, you know, we do have some sections of the district that are still pretty fire prone and need work. But I think, you know, we've learned a lot as we've gone along, especially with what we call the fuels reduction, sort of the catastrophic fire abatement work, so that we can try to do that in a way. In fact, the district sponsored a big research project on our property several years ago to look at the effects of these kinds of treatments on wildlife and groundwater resources and vegetation. So, you know, I think as all of us as partners have gone along, you know, we've learned more about what's worked and what hasn't worked, and, you know, how we can do some of these treatments to reduce some of the impacts on wildlife and hopefully have some positive effects on wildlife.
I just wanted to repeat to Yasmin some of the terminology that I was talking about. This work is making it sound to me like it's more and more of an alameda than a bosque. A bosque is a wild place, maybe overgrown and fire prone, and their people aren't caring for it. And the more they care for it, the more of an alameda it becomes. And maybe someday, well, I'm sure you've been up to Tamaya and all of that bosque. It's an alameda at this point. It's a beautiful cottonwood grove, very carefully tended. So how wild is the question? How wild is wild? Is always the question with all of the controversies that surround us. You know, how much of an alameda do we want? How much of a bosque do we want? What's the bosque all about? And it's all so ephemeral. One match can spoil all our work, right?
Or make some work for some of us. Blacker the forest, the bigger the check. There we go. There's a joke. I've always fought fire as a volunteer, so I never got paid for it. So anyway, so we're going to pass our 7:30 mark, but what I'd like to have is the opportunity for each of you to make a final statement. I'm just going to read these questions that are left, and if you want to include your statement to answer one of these elements, that'd be fine, or you can ignore them all completely and people can track you down afterwards. But the first thing is a shout out for Shining River Precious Land is a good start of reading. And so what portion of the, let's go with that. Should there be a Bosque Advisory Committee to harmonize decision making? Why doesn't the MRGCD leave Russian olive trees along the clear ditch for the birds to nest in and feed on the birds? Is the river safe for swimming, Paul? And please address the actual quality of the waters. And the year is 2030. What would you like to see has happened along the MRG? So if you want to answer any one of those questions, on any of them at all, and have the final.
As a founding member of the Rio Grande Surfing and Yacht Club in 1966, I've been swimming in the river my whole life, and I'm still here. So maybe I don't have much time left.
I mean, I would speak to what vision I'd like to see in 2030. I like that question. You know, I'd like to see a mixture of management of an Alameda and a Bosque. I'd like to see both. I'd like to see, you know, keeping as much wildness as we can in the system, but realizing also there's places that we're going to have to manage that are going to be different and are not going to be receiving the floods. So I'd like to see a beautiful place that I dare say grandkids can go to and have the same kind of experience that I have today going out there.
I really like the three sections that we worked on in the Bosque curriculum guide. I got to name them. The old river we called Rio Bravo, the really wild one that could sweep your community away. What's happened since the Corps moved in, we called that one Rio Manso, the tamed river. And I think what we're all working towards in all of this work, all of us every day, is something that the groups began calling Rio Nuevo. What is this new river that combines all of these different wild and tamed features?
You know, I'll talk to the 2030 question, and it's a difficult one because I'm going to really encourage you to come back for the forum that we're going to have April 1st, where we're going to be discussing climate change. There was a presentation actually here at the Natural History Museum recently on a federal report that came out looking at impacts of climate change on the Middle Rio Grande. And some of their projections are terrifying. You know, while we're worried right now about you know, putting paved trails in the Bosque, I'm worried about having a river at all in 2030. It is there's some very dire predictions in there. On a more optimistic note, I want to leave you with a concept that was put forth by our great historian Bill Du Bill, for a while, was promoting the notion of the Rio Poco Grande. And the notion was, you know, he'd seen these great pictures of the Rio Grande going from the mesa to Eden and back and forth. And his concept was that you can try to restore the natural functions of the river, just not on the grand scale. We need to really focus where the water is, where it's connected to the land, and make the most of that. And try to maintain those natural functions, you know, where it is possible. So hopefully we'll have enough water to do that. And to be honest, I'm not really sure if we will or not, but let's all try to work together and make the most of what we do keep.
Great. Well, I agree and like everything that was just said. I think we need to continue to do more of what we have been doing, particularly restoration projects where we're reconnecting the floodplain on the Bosque, like you said, on a little more of a Poco than a Grande scale. Because I think that's one of our few things that we can do right now that's possible with the water that we have. And like Adrian said, I don't know if that's going to be able to continue, but I think we need to really seriously think about some of the climate change predictions for the Rio Grande, and think about, you know, how we are going to adapt to some of what's being predicted, and how we can adapt to the Bosque to that, you know, and whether that's even possible. So, you know, the Bosque may not look like it does now, but it doesn't mean we can't have a natural environment there. It just may look different. It may provide different habitat. It may provide good habitat. It may be better than what's there now. But, you know, I think it's a very serious question in the future. How much are we going to be able to support some of these native species? You know, I was really kind of thinking about some similar questions. I live on one of the Conservancy ditches, 4-acre lateral, and I have some old gnarly cottonwoods behind my house. And, you know, it kind of occurred to me that when these trees go, you know, we think about, well, what will we replace them with? And then, you know, it occurred to me that, you know, the way that the ditches have to be run now very, very efficiently, and my ditch only runs every 2 weeks, you know, the thought that I could plant any cottonwoods there again is probably not that possible. So, you know, we may have to look at the ditches very differently, and we may have to look into our own backyards to try to replace some of that habitat in the future. So, you know, I think we just have to get creative. But you know, if we don't, frankly, I'll make a plug for agriculture. If we don't continue and increase some of the agriculture that we have in the valley, you know, a lot of the flood irrigation and the replenishing of the groundwater table, you know, we could see some big changes throughout the valley. So that would really affect the Bosque, because a lot of the water that we bring into the Middle Valley for irrigation and for the city's projects and the drinking water are what's supporting a lot of this riparian system here. And I think people really need to know that and understand that. It's very important. So, but thank you for being here.
Yeah. So thank you very much for being here. Thanks for the people who organized this, the museum, and the recognition again of our speakers, and the notion that we all share this watershed. It's all our backyard. And as you discovered in that little how-to-do session earlier, that you have lots of neighbors, even just in the aisle next to you, who have some investment in and connection to this river. So let's keep sharing ideas, and we'll see you back here on April 1st, if not along the Bosque.